Welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thanks for spending some time with us today. If you enjoy our conversation series, make sure you never miss an interview by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, b'naibrith.org, to learn more about our important work across the globe. Our guest today is fashion historian, author, and curator Keren Ben-Horin. Keren is currently enrolled in the History PhD program at NYU, where she is studying the material culture of ordinary people. Keren has curated 2 exhibits, co-created a documentary film, and wrote her master's thesis on the history of the luxury brand Gotex. Her other interests include 19th, 20th, and 21st century fashion, gender and identity performance, Israeli fashion, and the intersection of fashion and diplomacy. In her paper, Branding a New Nation State, Fashion and Israel's Diplomacy in the 1960s, Keren explores how fashion became an integral part of the way Israel created its national identity, and in how it represented itself to the world and formed relationships with other countries, especially the United States. From fashion shows by State of Israel bonds and other organizations, and strengthened ties between American Jewish and Israeli communities, to the fashion and diplomacy of Miriam Eshkol, wife of Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, fashion diplomacy not only played an important role in Israel's politics in its first 2 decades, but also provided women, who at the time were largely relegated to domestic spheres, a way to exert political influence. We'll also be speaking with Keren today about her work in researching and writing about the evolution of retail emporiums, department stores, and their history in 19th century New York. Keren, thanks for being here today. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Dan. This is such a beautiful introduction. Thank you.
Well, to start off, I'm curious to know what drew you to the subject of Israel and its fashion influence? Because when we talk about fashion diplomacy, we think about diplomacy being high-level meetings between countries, back-channel meetings, but you've discovered that fashion has played a very important role in Israel's diplomacy. So tell us about that. Where did your research begin, and what was the process like?
Absolutely. So my research actually began several years ago, if not decades, when I started looking at the work of Leah Gottlieb, the designer for Gotex. I have to admit, I was studying to be a fashion designer, and I was pretty ignorant about the history of fashion in Israel. And I started by I knew the name Gotex. I knew they were famous, but I didn't know much about it. When I started doing the research for my thesis first, and then for the film, I discovered that Gotex was a global brand. And in the process of this research, one of the things that kept coming up is the Israel Bonds fashion show, which Gotex participated in from very early, from almost the beginning, from sort of like the late 1950s. And again, like I always knew the name. In Israel, it's simply called Bonds. And I kind of knew about it, but I really didn't. And then something else happened where I was contacted by a government archive in Israel, where the papers of Levi Eshkol is stored in an historic house in Jerusalem. And they told me, a few years ago, his wife passed away. And the manager of the archive went to her apartment, which was around the corner from the archive, and retrieved garments that belonged to her, that belonged to the prime minister, ties, jackets, all sorts of garments that he felt had meaning, but he didn't really know what it was. But he was, she passed away, her apartment was being sort of like dissolved, and he wanted to save what he could. He just put it, some of it was already in suitcases, and he took it to the archive, and he was like, would you look at it? Can you make sense of it? And what was amazing, because it's a government archive, they actually have everything. They have the receipts for the clothes. They have letters concerning them. They have pictures because everything was documented. And I was really fascinated by that. And so I was like, okay, let me look at Miriam Eshkol and her role. And again, I was very ignorant about this, time in Israel's history when Israel was kind of forming very close relationship with the US. And so I wrote a paper about Miriam and her relationship. And I do have to say that she was very young. She was 34 years younger than the prime minister when they married. He was already a prime minister. And from the research, it seems that she was almost chosen because she had certain skills. She spoke a lot of languages. She was very educated. She had a master's degree in art history and was just going into a PhD program. She was also the Knesset librarian. So she knew a lot of people. She was very politically savvy. And at the time, the library at the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, was almost like an education center because a lot of the ministers and a lot of the people that were working in the Knesset were from the Labor Party. So they didn't have the diplomatic kind of skills. A lot of them didn't speak English. And so Miriam was sort of like an educator. She was pulling books for them, educating them, teaching them English. So she had both the diplomatic skills, but also was very strategically positioned and knew a lot of people. So she's kind of like chosen for this role. And I found that story really fascinating because I felt like this is such, I feel like sometimes women, because especially in government, because she was a prime minister's wife, it's not a formal role, and each prime minister's wife can do with that role whatever she wants. But in fact, de facto, she has a diplomatic role. And she works on behalf of the state, and how she's dressed and how she behaves, all of that is supposed to represent the state. So I was really interested in this network of women in diplomacy, and kind of like, what does it mean? What does it mean for decision making? What does it mean politically? And what's the role of fashion? Because fashion is a symbolic thing, like it tells the world like who we are, how we present ourselves, but it's also a consumer product. So it has, and for Israel during that time period, bringing in foreign currency was very important for infrastructure projects and for immigrant absorbent and all of that. Foreign currency was very important. So fashion does both of those things. Exporting fashion brought a lot of money into Israel.
Now, at the same time in the United States, because Levi Eshkol served as prime minister between 1963 and 1969, it was 6 years. At the same time in the United States, John Kennedy had been elected in 1960, and Jackie Kennedy, you could say, really introduced, at least in the modern era, because first ladies in the past, going back all the way to the founding fathers, had prominent roles and were seen as being important. But Jackie Kennedy in the modern era kind of set that tone for fashion diplomacy. So this was more or less at the same time. Was there any kind of recognition of what was going on here in that regard?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because when I was doing my research, I found a little newspaper clipping where Levi Eshkol says, when I got to France, it was a little bit like when JFK got there and they said, oh, it's Jackie's husband is here. So he felt the same about Miriam. And there was in Israeli media, there a lot of times they were compared because she was young. She was very vibrant, very educated, dressed very, very well. Miriam was actually friends with this woman who was a dressmaker in Israel, who was called like the national dressmaker because she was dressing all the diplomat wives and all the wives of the politicians, and they were very close friends. So in the archive, you can see receipts and you can see documentation of the relationship that they had. And actually, they corresponded for over 30 years. So she dressed her in kind of couture, French couture copies, which Jackie was also known for loving French couture, but she had to go to American designers to sort of like do adaptations of those styles. So very similar in that way. But I think like it's important to say that there's another facet to this story in how and why fashion became so important during that time period. And one of the things that the Kennedys are kind of known for, it's not something they invented, but they're maybe most known for, is the use of what we now call soft power. So this idea that instead of wars, you can influence state relationships by kind of, you could call it branding, right? It's branding the nation. So it's using popular culture, it's using fashion, it's using, you could say, cultural assets of the country. And that is something that dominates diplomatic relationships in the post-Second War years. And that's exactly the time when Israel is established and when Israel starts forming relationships with Western allies. And so this idea of the soft power of using the cultural assets of the country are becoming very important.
What was the Israeli design scene like at that period? You talked about a designer who worked with Mariaschin, you talked about Gotex. What was it like? How many people were actually involved in the fashion design trade? We know that there were manufacturing companies, there were textile companies, but in terms of design, tell us about that.
A lot. So again, this is and I'll go actually back and I'll say that even before Israel is a state, there's a lot of textile and fashion commerce. Whether it's importing textiles, whether it's producing textiles in Israel. Jewish people have a long history in the needle trade, in tailoring. So when those, what was then called the textile immigration wave of the 1930s and early 40s, so there is a vibrant scene of commerce. In the beginning, a lot of the fashion was what we called certified copies, especially after when kind of the couture houses in Paris start reopening after the war. A lot of kind of dressmakers, they travel to France and they buy from the couture houses certified copies of patterns that they can then bring to Israel and kind of reproduce it. But in Israel during that time period, it's almost like two worlds. So you have kind of Tel Aviv and those dressmakers and a lot of people that are dressing like they're in Vienna or Berlin, right? It's not really what we think about as Israeli. At the same time, we have, the settlers, we have people who are labor people who are working the land, who go out to settlements and kibbutzes. And there is this ethos of the Israeli that's clean from ornamentation, clean from any, immigrant identity, and that is reflected in how simply people are dressed. And also, during the war, Israel adopts the utility guidelines during the war. So there's rationing of food, there's rationing of textiles. So all of that really influences what is happening in Israel. Then towards the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, we start having this shift there are several things that affect this shift, but maybe the biggest one is even greater change in global fashion, or in Western fashion rather, where in the 1960s we see people starting in the West, starting to really be interested in non-Western cultures, and by extension, design and lifestyle and so forth. And at the same time, we have in Israel kind of younger designers who, a lot of them are either first generation immigrants in Israel or second generation. So they're not, they're really still immersed in their families' craft traditions from different places, whether it's Bulgaria, Hungary, Morocco, Iraq, all the places where Jewish people left and came to Israel. And these people are starting to really look at those crafts for inspiration. And they also start looking at Israel itself, the land, the landscapes, the Mediterranean, the desert. All of that becomes an inspiration. And we get this new Israeli aesthetic that looks both ancient and new at the same time. And that sort of like becomes this Israeli signature look. So something that seems very fresh at the time, a lot of vibrant colors, very fluid silhouettes, kaftans, but then also embroideries and reproductions of fabrics that are found in archaeological excavations. So really kind of referencing Israel's sort of like quote unquote biblical history. And I see you want to ask something.
No, I know. I want to ask you because, I mean, I remember that Ruth Dayan with her Maskit organization celebrated exactly what you're saying. In other words, celebrated the natural habitat, if you will, natural fashion habitat and everything else of the state of Israel, the young state of Israel at the time. And that extended to handicrafts, but also to fashion, because you mentioned kaftans. And I remember that Maskit was, for American tourists, for example, who were coming to Israel, there was always a stop at Maskit to see what was in the store. But tell us about that. I mean, was that part of what you're saying, that this was kind of a celebration of
it was a big part.
The surroundings?
It was a big part. It was a big part. And Ruth Dayan, actually, we have to think about it as a social project, not just a fashion or design project, because she and Finny Leiderstroff, who was the designer for Maskit, they would go out to the periphery, to immigrant camps, and they will seek out these women who brought their traditional craft to Israel. And they had this idea, instead of stripping them like we did before from their home country's traditions and making them into Israeli, let's take what they bring from their countries and incorporate that into what it means to be Israeli. And that was the big Maskit innovation, that they were not seeking to remake the immigrants into Israelis, but they were rather seeking to remake Israeliness by incorporating these craft, these visuals, this imagery from all over the Jewish diaspora.
So it was less Paris and more Negev,
exactly,
if you will.
Exactly. Exactly. And that really resonated. Like, it was a perfect timing for that. And Israeli fashion in the 1960s is covered by Vogue. It's an attraction. It's covered in French magazines. It's something that attracts people. And when I did my research on Gotex, one of the things that amazed me is that the buyers from Saks, from Bloomingdale's, from all the big department stores, they would travel to Israel to see the collections. And so that tells you how much they valued Israeli design during that time period.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, I remember companies like Gotex uh, for diaspora Jews, speaking now as an American Jew, there was great pride in our family in the fact that this brand was being sold right here in the United States. This was an Israeli brand, and I heard it many times that this was something that there was a great deal of pride in. So bring it forward to today. Where is the fashion scene today?
You mean in Israel?
In Israel.
Things have changed, and a lot of it has to do with government support. And because it is important to say that during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the government invested a lot in the Israeli fashion and textile industry. In the late 1970s and early 80s, there was a shift. The government funneled money that previously went to industry into militarization, into protecting borders. And that resulted in the total collapse of the industry in Israel. Not so much the design, but the ability to produce. And that combined with sort of like the rise of the Far East as this global manufacturer, and the Israeli fashion industry was no longer competitive. Today, what happens is something really interesting, because I think in terms of production, the limitations are still very much there, and it's very hard for young designers or new designers to produce, and even for established designers. So they're working on a much smaller scale than we've seen before. But what happens because of social media, they no longer need this mediation of the state, and they can really go out and make these global connections independently through social media. So, and there are a lot of like interesting designers that are coming and collaborations, and there are young Israeli designer like Shahar Net, who's dressing Beyonce, and other actresses and famous people. Alon Livnei, who mostly does evening wear and bridal, is extremely successful. And there are a number of other designers. I think the creativity is very much there. And I think actually because production is so complicated in Israel, that really challenges the designers in a way that they have to be very creative about materials, about cuts, about how to produce what they want, how to achieve different things. And you could really see that in the materiality. And I think that's what makes Israeli designers have this like very unique approach to design, because they kind of have to make their own materials. So I think it's a very, very vibrant and creative scene working in a very challenging environment.
Well, Keren, I'd like to now go way back in history. I'd like to go back 160 years or so, because you've also written on the genesis, the origins of the department stores in Manhattan, the great department stores ultimately that came out of that period, the 1850s, 1860s. Tell us first how you came to have an interest in that, and a little about your research on the subject.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been a New Yorker for 15 years now. And like every good New Yorker, I'm really obsessed with real estate. And so what I discovered, what sort of like got me interested in this world of department stores, was the move north on the island from the South Ferry area up north of the department stores that happened during the 19th century. And we see this sort of like real estate development in the city, where you could say that commerce chases residential life. So at the beginning, all of the commerce in New York is centered at sort of like around the harbor, where it's very easy to get goods from the harbor. So we have what's called dry goods stores, and essentially it's sort of like the precursor to the department store. At the time, it's relatively small, and it's always dominated by the shopkeeper. You have to ask for things. It's not like you walk into a store today and you can browse. So it's very much like this controlled environment. Then downtown New York becomes very congested. It's very dirty. There is a lot going around, carriages and restaurants and hotels and merchants. And so the wealthy people start climbing up. And every time they climb up and establish a new neighborhood that's suburban in a way, if you want to think about it in this way. So it's sort of like, it's quiet, it's greener, it's not in the middle of commerce. Every time they do that, the dry goods stores follow them, and then they go up again. And during the 19th century, we have something that is called the ideology of the separate spheres. This was not something that really happened in practice, but what governed how respectable a woman was considered related to her ability to stay within the domestic sphere. And respectable middle-class women did not just venture out on their own. They were always, walking in pairs. If it was a younger woman, she would have a chaperone. And a lot of the way that fashion was consumed was in private spaces. So you have a dressmaker come to you and make your dress at home. When the department stores, when the dry goods stores started growing, they became sort of like domestic spaces within a public space, meaning women felt respectable enough and safe enough to go into the department store where they can socialize with other middle class or elite women. And so these department stores, we don't actually call them department stores until the very, very late 19th century. But these emporiums of goods are becoming really, they were called palaces because they were huge buildings, sometimes 5, 6, 7 floors. And they were set up to be a space for socializing. So in addition to goods from all over the world, goods manufactured on premises, a lot of those dry goods stores or emporiums had a manufacturing floor where you would have women make corsets, especially undergarments, accessories, corsets, crinolines, all of those underpinnings that women during that time period needed. Those were the first things that were available, what we now call ready-made. At the time, we still don't have actual dresses ready-made. Women go there and they buy the fabrics and they buy the trimmings and they buy the home goods and all of those things that they need, but they can also have lunch. We have another interesting innovation during that time period. It's the big mirrors that we now take for granted, only appear in the middle of the 18th century. And so now women can look at themselves in those huge mirrors and they have dressing rooms. And then again, there's like this move north in the island. And these department stores are becoming even bigger and bigger. And they become aspirational spaces, a place where even the poor can come and look at the windows. This was also a 19th century innovation, looking at beautiful things at the window, even if you cannot buy them.
So tell me, where now are we in Manhattan? We're moving north. Is this in Soho? Is this north of Soho? Because I know when we visit New York City and go to Soho and see these magnificent cast iron buildings, you try to imagine what life was
Right.
like in the period when these buildings were
So
constructed.
it
So
so it
where
went
are
like
we at this
this.
point?
So it went to Grand Street. That was sort of like the first stop where a lot of, so Lord and Taylor was actually the first dry good, like the oldest dry goods store in New York. They started in the near the on Catherine Street, way downtown.
I think that was in
During
the
the
1830s, if I'm not
Yes,
mistaken.
1832, if I'm not mistaken. And they moved to Grand Street first. And oftentimes they don't necessarily close the other branch, but they open more. And then later on they do. Um, so Grand Street becomes the center in the 40s and 50s. And then we get to Union Square area. And then it starts expanding north towards 23rd Street. When Macy's opened on 34th Street, where it still is today, that was outside of what we call the Ladies' Mile, this area between Union Square and 23rd Street, where women were strolling, and there were department stores and smaller stores, and women would stroll from store to store and sort of like spend an afternoon. And it was only later, towards the very end of the century, that we get Bloomingdale's and Saks moving way uptown. So that was, and that's sort of like the evolution in terms of location.
What about the Jewish community? Now the rise of the department stores, the move of the department stores, and the growth occurred before that big, or started at least before that big period of immigration, let's say from 1880 to 1924. But you say that they were inside the stores, they were manufacturing or sewing garments.
Right.
What about the labor picture? Were Jews involved in that as well? Because we know about sweatshops and we know about the
Right.
garment industry. Were they also employed in those places?
Yes. And also, it's really important to say that during that time period, we don't really have the distinction between couture and department stores the way we have it now. Like, we think about couture as this high end, right? And department stores as something for the rest of us. During that time period, each department store has what we could now call a couture salon, meaning women come there and there's someone who fits them and makes the dress for them there. And every department store, as I said, had, or most of them had, manufacturing floors. But in addition, and this is where a lot of the Jewish labor comes into place, especially in the earlier years, families in tenements are producing garments, simple garments, men's garments, underwear, undergarments in tenement apartments. So they don't necessarily work on premises. They work in their apartments, and they produce. It could be hats. It could be fabric flowers. It could be different trimmings, and all of that is manufactured within sort of like this family business, and then brought into the department store. Then later on, and also I want to say that we oftentimes think about sort of like the sweatshop as this like unskilled, that the Jewish people were like unskilled labor. But in fact, what's interesting is that one of the reasons that Jewish people so easily were integrated into the garment industry in New York is because in Eastern Europe, in Russia, there were laws determining what work Jewish people can do. And one of the few things that they could do was the needle trade. So a lot of women from Eastern Europe coming into the United States they were highly skilled, and those are the women and the men that are coming into the garment industry. It's only later on that we get those big independent factories where we see this quote unquote unskilled labor essentially making people disposable. Like you can always be replaced by someone else who can do the same job. And one of the reasons that's happening is because manufacturing is being streamlined by breaking apart the manufacturing process. So instead of someone, for example, constructing a shirtwaist from cutting through, sewing, and finishing, now you have this process broken down into different processes. You have one person cutting, one person sewing, one person doing the finishing. And that allows factory owners to train unskilled people to do those basic jobs. And that eliminates the need for more expensive, more skilled labor. And because Jewish immigration, and I think immigration in general, tends to like a family someone brings a family member into the business. That's what's happening in New York, is that a lot of these factories were a lot of people who are either came from the same town in Russia or Germany, or were relatives. So that's how we get a lot of Jewish people into the garment industry.
Just one more question. Before the great wave of immigration from Eastern Europe, of course, there was the wave of immigration from Central Europe, which Germany and other countries in Central Europe, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, etc. And it seems that many of the great department stores, which were founded in the 19th century, early 20th century, not only in New York City, but in countries around cities around the country, going as far west as, of course, as California and everything in between, that many of them came from that German Jewish community. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, there's a wonderful book by Hasia Diner who talks about the genesis of the peddlers. It's really interesting. So Jewish people would peddle, meaning they would have a cart with a few goods, and they would literally walk town to town. And this is how you get Jewish people in Ohio or, in the Midwest or in California. Because, how come, we think of sort of like these port cities as places where immigrants come to work. But then what happens with this peddling, like I said, you have a person starts peddling, start bringing his dad, his brother, his cousin. At the beginning, it was men. So they would go out, peddle for a few days, and then come back and reload the cart and go out again. And then what happened eventually, they start also bringing the wives, the daughters, the whole family. And now the family starts by establishing physical shops in these cities, from which the peddlers sort of like, it sort of like becomes like this satellite where the peddlers can come, reload from their own store now, and take it to smaller places. And eventually, that's how we get Jewish people in all over the country kind of having these stores, small department stores, where you could essentially get anything, right? You can get garments, you can get pans and pots, you can get silverware, you can get all of those things that before were peddled on carts, and now it's a Jewish-owned family business.
Well, my family actually has kind of 2 feet in that history. One grandfather was a tailor, an immigrant tailor in Brooklyn, and the other was a peddler in the backwoods of the state of Maine. So I take a great interest in it also from a family perspective. Keren, thank you so much for being here today, sharing your work on the fascinating history of fashion in Israel's early diplomacy, as well as the great department stores, how they started in New York. A real pleasure to have you with us.
Same, the pleasure is mine. Thank you.
Well, our thanks to Keren Ben-Horin for guiding us through the world of fashion diplomacy. And thank you for tuning into this conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you enjoyed this interview, make sure you catch all of our programs by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work, including our efforts on the ground, providing Ukrainian refugees in Poland, Moldova, and Romania, as well as those suffering horrifying wartime conditions in Ukraine with basic necessities. For my guest, Keren Ben-Horin, and for B'nai B'rith, I'm Dan Mariaschin. Join us again soon.